Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with random book reviews from the Overflow Room Annex. And I've got three really interesting books. I think these are biographies for the most part. Well, yeah, somewhat biographical. Yes, they are. And very interesting ones at that. First, we begin with Glinka. His autobiography, his memoirs, actually, translated by Richard B. Mudge. Glinka is an interesting character. I was fascinated by him because he was a vibrato guy. Because, he actually notated vibrato all over the place in his scores, which I found fascinating. And what really interested me about him, reading more about his life, was that, he was, of course, the father of Russian music, the Russian Nationalist School. And he worked mostly in the 1840s and 50s. His style was almost wholly Italian in its origins. He studied in Milan and then toured. He did the grand tour of Europe. His family had money. His mother had money particularly. And he wrote this set of memoirs. They are the most wonderfully honest memoirs. I mean, he's just totally straightforward about everything that he did. I mean, he caught VD from a Spanish hooker. I mean, who else is going to say that? In the 18 whatevers, he just described his life. And I just couldn't put this thing down. I really couldn't. I just thought it was so cool. It's a whole aspect of life that we don't pay attention to. Or, most of us don't. I mean, the Russian school, of course, we think it starts with Tchaikovsky and Rimsky-Korsakov, and its origins are things that we don't really give much thought to. But the other thing that really struck me was, reading this and other histories of the period, was just how important Italian music is. We who love orchestral music or instrumental music, or who grew up heavily influenced in the United States and England, and those places particularly, by the German school and German schools of thought and German views of what music history is, tend to completely ignore Italy and Italian music. But it was so important. It really was. It was still, even composers who make fun of it, like Richard Strauss in his opera Capriccio, you've got the Italian singers and they're stupid and they're drunk and they're obnoxious. And, he had this, there's this view of them as sort of like musical cockroaches, they're just everywhere and you can't get rid of them. But they were amazing musicians, and there were a lot of them, like Strauss points out, I guess. And the Italian school was critical to the formation of all of these national schools. It wasn't just because, in France there was the Prix de Rome where they shipped you off to Italy, which Berlioz made fun of. It was the fact that audiences loved that music. And Italian singers, Italian musicians and performers were touring Europe constantly, performing that repertoire. It was the backbone of the operatic repertoire, and it was the backbone of Glinka's style, and to a certain degree, as I pointed out in various essays and other times, Mahler's style. Even though he wouldn't have admitted it, even though he would have been a Wagnerite, it was there. It became the lingua franca of 19th century Romantic music. And 18th century music, Mozart's great operas were Italian operas. I mean, we forget about that. We don't want to know. And so I learned an awful lot reading Glinka's memoirs. I really did. Whether they liked it in Italy or didn't like it in Italy, Spohr was horrified by the musical culture in Italy, but they had to go. And the language of music, even today, allegro, presto, crescendo, is Italian. And not because it's just some memory of things that happened centuries past. It's because it was part of a living tradition. And Glinka was part of that tradition, even as he became the father of the Russian National School of Music, which I think is just totally cool. So there was that. Then, after Glinka's memoirs, this is wonderful. Living with Liszt. This is fun. we often read biographies, and there are wonderful biographies of Liszt, of course, but going to primary sources when they're accessible, especially if they're accessible in English, which is a big deal if you're talking about Central European characters. Unless you are fluent in those languages, you either need to read things in translation or. So Karl Lachmund was a pupil of Liszt, an American pupil of Liszt from 1882 to 1884. And he wrote everything down, what it was really like to live with Liszt. It was weird. It's what it was. But he kept a diary which ran to some 700 pages, according to this. He studied with Liszt in Weimar between 1882 and 1844. It's one of the most exhaustive accounts of Liszt's keyboard instruction. Sometime after World War I, and in response to demand from a number of musicians, Lachmann decided to turn his diary into a book about his daily life with Liszt. In order to gather additional background material about a period long past, he wrote to more than 200 musicians in America and Europe who had had some personal contact with the composer and invited them to share their personal reminiscences. The book never appeared, and his papers came to rest in the New York Public Library, with whose cooperation this book is now being published. The Liszt scholar Alan Walker undertook the task of introducing, editing, and annotating the papers. He calls the diary an irreplaceable source of first-hand material which throws fresh light on the way Liszt taught the piano. Liszt also emerges from these pages as a great and noble human being, and he was. And it's marvelous, and it's fascinating. And Liszt's relationship with his students is so interesting. They'd all just get together in this study and they'd pick out some music to play, and you'd have someone play it and he'd scream at them, and you know how it goes. He didn't play very often. Sometimes he did, but not very often. And so he just writes it all down. And if you're interested in Liszt, if you're interested in the history of the piano pedagogy, you got to read this book. You just have to read it. It's just totally, absolutely, awesomely cool. And it's fascinating that it only came out recently, that this source was available, but it had not been published. I find that absolutely staggeringly incredible to know it was published. Let's see, when did this come out? Living with Liszt. Where's the date? Karl Lachmann Diaries, 1994. 1994. Think about it, 30 years ago. Astonishing, isn't it? So that's nifty. And then, last but not least, oh boy, Harvey Sachs is at it again. The ultimate Toscanini biographer and authority, the letters of Arturo Toscanini. All of them. Oh my. This is really, really cool. It includes his love letters, some of which are quite graphic. But there's a lot here. And Harvey Sachs always does justice to his subject here. I mean, he is the guy, the go-to guy for information on Toscanini. So this is quite a collection of letters. I mean, do we want to talk about it? I don't know. There's just zillions and zillions of letters. I mean, it's just his wife and his kids and other artists, and my, oh my. To the most illustrious Duke Uberto Visconti di Madrone, Senator of the Realm. When is this? 1916. La Scala's official program for the coming season, which is known to have been prepared by the impresario of the Teatro Colón of Buenos Aires, Mr. Walter Mocchi, and approved by you, Duke, has now been made public, and I am rising up to protest against you. Yes, for violating a noble tradition of high moral significance, well established for years at La Scala, rooted in the conscience of the public and of the entire citizenry. The obviously secretive arrival on the scene of Mr. Walter Mocchi, and the most singular exponent of theatrical speculation, to share with you the responsibility for La Scala's artistic decency, constitutes that violation. And this is happening precisely in the theater that 18 years ago was rescued with noble intentions and aspirations from the hands of speculators by your father, Duke Guido Visconti di Madrone, whom I still honor and remember with reverent affection, together with distinguished citizenry worthy of him. You could not have been more badly advised, if you were advised at all, in this rash act. That's just the beginning. This letter goes on for pages. And I just picked that up at random. So that gives you an idea of how much fun you're going to have with this one. This is hot stuff. Juicy, juicy, juicy. So there you have it. 3 really marvelous books that provide just in these 3 books, just a world of primary source material. Get it direct, not at secondhand. That's the lesson here. And you will find yourself, I think, ennobled and enraptured in your musical peregrinations. So keep on reading and listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.